do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes. Of course one enjoys the feeling of power. The newspaper can create great controversies, stir up arguments within the community, discussion, can throw light on injustices, just as it can do the opposite. It can hide things and be a great power for evil. It's not a perfect system, obviously, but can you think of a better one?
Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of Murdocracy, the podcast that keeps an eye on the news and influence of News Corp, the most influential media company in the Western world. I'm Cam Wilson.
And I'm Sami Shah.
Hey, Sami, how are you?
Good. I'm in Melbourne, where the COVID numbers are rising astronomically day by day, and we're watching Sydney open up again. So not at all jealous, bitter, resentful, holding a grudge, or any of those things. Doing wonderfully, I can assure you.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. So happy for you guys.
Thank you. I'm happy here in Sydney as well. I kind of tuned out of COVID numbers. I think when we hit the 4 digits, and I knew vaccination rates are going up, and I personally have been double vaxxed, I kind of just peaced out. And I saw that numbers had fallen, but to some extent I was like, I don't know, it is what it is.
Yeah, I've been like that as well. Especially, you're right. Once I got the double vax thing done, I've really stopped caring about the numbers, and but I only kind of tuned back in again when I realized Sydney's reopening. And then I was like, wait, and we're like in the 1,000 plus now. Like, this is not good.
Into it. Yeah, I know, it's crazy hard. And Sami, you haven't been subjected to any abuse from the Cowals Palace, have you?
Oh, from the Kowals Palace. I mean, I'm constantly subjected to abuse from the Kowals Palace. Hell, some would argue I am an abuser on the Kowals Palace as well. So,
a prince of the Kowals Palace.
Look, it's not a bad title for Twitter. I gotta give Scott Morrison that one. It is fairly clever.
Yeah, it is. Look, I'm an internet reporter, as you know, and it's actually quite often that Scott Morrison has a bit of a whack at social media. This week it was because it came off the back of Barnaby Joyce refuting I think like online rumors and allegations that his daughter had been having an affair with John Barilaro, and that's why John Barilaro stepped down. I mean, obviously, people say anything online, and that can be pretty gross. It's such an interesting thing to me because there are so many things out there to really be passionate and care about, particularly as a politician. There's climate change, there's, poverty, with at the moment, there's no COVID supplement for people on welfare. But the thing that seems to get politicians all the time upset is abuse on social media. And I think that's just because it actually affects them.
Yeah, I think that is largely a big part of it. And I think also it's the only reason why there's an overlap between politicians and, people with even a mildly public profile, like myself and yourself even. Because as you saw, Gavin Morris, the ABC news director, has resigned. And one of his outgoing statements was, I don't see any reason why journalists should be on Twitter.
Oh, man.
And this is something I ran up against in the ABC all the time. Managers and stuff would always say, why are you on Twitter? And my argument would always be, you have a full-time job and your face and your name isn't your brand. I don't have a full-time job, so I need to stay on Twitter to promote myself, sell tickets, etc. And the moment I step away from it, no one will know who I am, and I won't get a full-time job with you guys. So, and I think politicians are in the same boat. Their social media presence does become a big part of their identity, their brand, and everything. And so I think there's a bit of sympathy and overlap, but clearly, when it comes to priorities, they prioritize this way above everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And if you do want to come into our little corner of the Cowals Palace, we have our own little court. We are Murdocracy on Twitter. I think we're Murdocracy on Facebook. We have a Facebook group as well. And Sami, you're at Sami Shah on Twitter?
I am indeed at Sami Shah on Twitter, and I have Facebook as well, which is samishah.fans. I couldn't get just this dot Sami Shah or whatever Facebook fan page.
It sounds like a link to your OnlyFans, which I'm very intrigued.
I do show my butthole a lot, yes.
But only to paying subscribers.
Yes.
Today, we're speaking to Jennine Khalik, who is a Australian journalist who has worked in the industry for a bunch of years. And she's faced some pretty tough dealings as a result of her Palestinian heritage. And her coverage of Israel-Palestine and just Palestine in itself, including at News Corp. And there's some pretty shocking stories that we want to share with you. But before we get onto that, it is time for News Corp News of the Week. Horrifying is what Tucker Carlson called the national COVID-19 response by Australia and not the US, a country that suffered more than 700 times the death toll of here. The Fox News primetime host, who broadcasts to more than 3 million people every day, made these comments during the book launch of Australian editor Sharry Markson's new book, What Really Happened in Wuhan. The Guardian's Amanda Mead reported Carlson made the comments regarding Australia's COVID-19 restrictions, which he says are just so destructive of basic civil liberties. Sami, what did you think of Tucker Carlson parachuting in here and having an opinion on how Australia's been dealing with COVID?
For me, it's astounding that Sharry Markson would have Tucker Carlson being the person who launches a book for her in the first place, given the fact that the most recent controversy about him is his advocacy for the Great Replacement Theory, which is a theory that, white people are being, quote unquote, bred out of Western countries, that, all the immigrants and stuff are coming here with this underlying plan of breeding ourselves more so that there's less white people and then we can take over with the demographics. And he, it's a white supremacist theory. It goes back ages, and Tucker Carlson has talked about it quite openly on air as something that he is fairly confident in believing Joe Biden is advocating for as well, etc. So Sharry Markson talking to him was disappointing, even for someone who's perpetually disappointed with Sharry Markson's continued existence. The thing that I found interesting is how Roman Dean, Sharry Markson, all of them just agree so vehemently with this idea that Australia is this complete prison, and we are living in a George Orwell level, just complete, North Korean, giving up of our civil liberties and stuff. And America has done it right. America, for some reason, is still the symbol of freedom and still the symbol of hope and still the symbol of individuality. It's just this remarkable Joe Rogan comment section level bullshit.
The reason that Sharry wanted Tucker Carlson to launch this, despite, the views that he has platformed on his show or even espoused himself, like the Great Replacement Theory, is because he's actually one of the most popular media personalities in the world. Like 3 million people watch his show every night. He has had incredible influence over American and even international politics by the topics that he focused on. And in fact, he has, over the last couple of months, honed in on Australia on his show, picking these very often viral footage of interactions between, anti-lockdown protesters and police, and that often end up in, what can be actually quite horrible arrests, and saying, Australia has no civil liberties anymore. He's created this lens of Australia that is actually, becoming very popular outside of Australia. And that's what we kind of saw this week, where, I don't know if you saw this, Sami, but there were people who were literally protesting outside the Australian Consulate General in New York with Australian flags saying "Save Australia," because to them, Australia has become some crazy police state, which is crazy to me because I know that there's, that we have temporarily sacrificed some civil liberties for public health. And I do think that there is a really big discussion that needs to happen around how police are dealing with protesters and just generally, about police brutality. But Definitely. Australia is doing so much better than the US out of COVID. We have 700 times fewer deaths, despite being 1/16 of the size. We are doing heaps better. Tucker Carlson is saying, look at this dictatorship, look at this awful state. Meanwhile, in the country around him, people are literally dying.
The thing that you point out is the most pertinent here is how popular Tucker Carlson is. He's popular enough that Lachlan Murdoch, who's the chief executive of the Fox Corporation, he's actually backed Tucker Carlson in this and said, no, he's not, he's not saying a white replacement theory. This is about a voting rights question, things like that. Tucker Carlson's felt so empowered. He's even told the ADL, which is the Anti-Defamation League, one of the most prominent historic organizations in America that deals with anti-Semitism, and he said, fuck them. quote, I'm literally quoting here. He told Megyn Kelly, quote unquote, fuck them. The ADL was a noble organization that had a very specific goal, which was to fight anti-Semitism. They were pretty successful over the years. Now it's operated by a guy who's just an apachick of the Democratic Party. And you see so much, which is, this is another white supremacist talking point. So it's kind of remarkable to see some of this stuff happening. My favorite thing that he said in his discussion with Sherry Markson is that he praised colonial Britain, which, quote, ruled the world because the Britons were tough as hell, really tough and independent-minded. That's why they dominated, and they bequeathed to the world this remarkable culture and justice system and language, and they really improved the world way more than any other group ever. Which, as a person from what was once India, I have a few complaints with that whole point of view about colonial Britain's greatness. And the other thing is, he goes, I'm ashamed. I cannot believe this is happening in my country, where the fiercely independent Americans and stuff like that have been talking about, watching Australia in horror.
Hey, Sammy, are you into NRL at all?
Not even a little bit.
No,
but,
me neither.
But I did read the stories. I have a very love and hate relationship with sports overall, in that I love to hate all sports.
I'm not as much of a hater. I'm big into NBA and AFL, but NRL never really has caught my fancy. But there was 2 stories this week about the NRL involving News Corp that really took me by surprise. The first one was that News Corp is set to inject $75 million into the NRL, including, according to Nine Papers' Michael Chammas. The deal will reduce the number of free-to-air games of News Corp-owned Brisbane Broncos by up to 25%, and will include a proposal for another team, the Redcliffe Dolphins, great name, to join the league. Chammas writes, the Broncos have proven a ratings bonanza over the past decade, with News Corp now set to benefit from the popularities of the game's most powerful club, with an influx of games on Saturday and Sundays. Sammy, did you know that News Corp, this media company, this entertainment company, was actually such a big part of a sports league like this?
I knew that, for example, News Corp and Nine Entertainment were, managing some of the media stuff for NRL, but I didn't realize that. I don't know. This is all shocking to me that they have such an influence, into the point where they control certain teams, which new team comes in. And then also, if you're a Broncos fan, does this mean that, you've enjoyed them on free to air for so long? Now you're going to have to start paying for subscriptions just to continue watching your favorite team? Why are you being punished for this?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, this is getting into something that we've talked about that I find very interesting, which is where News Corp is kind of pushing Foxtel. But the idea of, can we get, fewer things on free to air and more onto our own service, which we're monetizing? And so this is where you're seeing, it's kind of a bit of almost self-dealing, where you've got News Corp is paying the rights to show games, but it also it runs the Brisbane Broncos, and so it's kind of pushing their games onto its services, where people can't see it unless they subscribe to something like Foxtel or KO. And I wonder, if it was me, if I was running a football club like this, I would be like, well, sure, I'd want all of my games on free to air, or I'd want as many as possible, because you want to reach as many people as possible. But no, they're actually saying, well, we know they've got this membership, but rather than trying to reach more people, we're going to try and shove them over onto Foxtel. And it shows that how all of this, in a way, is kind of a strategy for them to just take people from football fans into ultimately Foxtel subscribers.
So is it common knowledge that the football teams, or the NRL teams, rather rugby teams, are basically large advertising services for KO? That's what it seems like, right?
Yeah, totally. I'm not sure. I mean, I have to say, I haven't followed the NRL super closely, and so that's why I'm interested in this. And I don't know what the history, and maybe we should in the future do a bit of a deep dive into this, because I know that News Corp has a lot to do with betting, and obviously there have been major partners of sports leagues for a while. I wasn't aware that they kind of own the team, but I do think that, like, you know, increasingly it seems like every part of, like, you know, media companies are expanding to be so much more than media, ultimately with the goal of trying to get people to, you know, pay for their media. And so that's why they're getting, like, you know, they own things like, you know, the Broncos. But there was a second part in this that was also very interesting as well. Nine's Zoe Samius writes that the NRL itself has bowed to pressure from its media partners, including News Corp, and has decided to scale down its digital content arm in a move that's expected to result in 10 redundancies. They'll be sacked under a plan which will see the NRL stop making their own content and work more closely with Nine and Yes News Corp, their media partners. The NRL Digital Network was launched in 2018, and it saw clubs investing money in digital rather than outsourcing it to media partners, which meant that, like, NRL.com.au was producing its own journalism. So, you know, external to the fact that they were running the league, they're also reporting on things. They were saying this thing is happening. Here's my kind of take on it. I've always been fascinated by sports leagues making their own content. Like AFL does it as well.
Yeah.
The NBA does it as well. And it's very interesting because, like, it is kind of that conflict of interest where it allows the company to shape their own narratives. Like, I mean, you wouldn't see many other places where companies would have a media arm that's essentially reporting on itself. It seems like a, you know, huge conflict of interest, but they have done some really interesting stuff. Them giving up this, them saying we're not going to do that now, seems like it is a capitulation to the networks to give them more control over the league, which in the long run, like, I don't know, it seems to me like a kind of short-sighted decision because, you know, if you're giving more and more power to how your league is portrayed by the companies who are paying you to show their stuff, it means that you essentially have, like, less control over your fate.
Well, the other thing that's interesting about this is the entire decision to fade out the digital arm of the NRL came from Alexi Baker, who's very recently appointed as the Chief Customer and Digital Officer of the NRL. And if you look at Alexi Baker's LinkedIn, her job just before this one was working for Channel 9. You know, for 9 years, she was the managing director commercial for Channel 9. She was director of strategy and corporate development. This is a strategy person who worked for Channel 9 and then shifted over to NRL. And then weirdly, the NRL folded up its digital arm and handed it over to Channel 9 and News Corp. So I do think that seems to have been something that clearly the Channel 9 News Corp have been pushing for a long while. As always, my heart goes out to the people in the NRL. There's 10 people who are working in this digital team who are now going to be jobless. And they're not going to get hired by News Corp and Channel 9. They're just going to end up working somewhere else because they've lost their jobs.
Yeah, it is sad. It is sad to see journalism jobs going anywhere. Finally, News Corp has bought a majority stake in the nation's largest full-service video production company, a company called Visual Domain. And that's according to the Australian's Sophie Ellsworth. Visual Domain does about 300 videos a week. And according to the press release, this purchase will bolster News Corp's video making abilities. Here's a quote from the Australasia executive, Michael Miller. This investment in Visual Domain with its experienced in-house team and full-service offering, from live stream events to high-end television commercials and social media, provides News Corp Australia with immediate scale in video production to better serve our clients' business goals and the increased demand for these capabilities. I mean, this is all like, you know, kind of marketing mumbo jumbo and industry news that I think most people would never even hear about. But to me, it's just another reminder that News Corp goes far beyond just being, you know, a company that does the papers and does, you know, broadcast stuff on Foxtel as well. It really shows about how so much of these companies now are trying to be full service to their advertisers. So they're saying, you know, not only do we we do journalism, we broadcast sport, we also know that the people who are going to watch those things, we're able to sell access in a way to them, to advertisers.
Well, it goes back to the thing that you talked about last week, if you remember, which was you said they're making a lot of money. News Corp is very profitable this year. Revenues have apparently been rising 4% and up 30% in the fourth quarter. And so the money's burning a hole in their pocket. So what do you do when you got lots of money? You buy yourself a nice little, you know, computer graphics, animation, video production company. And Visual Domain is huge. They're, like you said, that's a lot of videos they make in a week. And And this does provide them with the service, with News Corp, with the ability to be all in-house. I'm wondering if this will mean, if the visual domain leaving the market and then only focusing its content on News Corp. Does that allow the space for other smaller production companies to come up? Like, what roll-on effect this will have on the industry? But yeah, meanwhile, it does seem like just News Corp kind of buying itself something blingy to feel nice about its performance bonus.
Yeah, toss a couple of dollars and bring in a full service video company, the biggest one in Australia.
Why not?
And there was one just final interesting tidbit in this article that I am keenly paying attention to. It mentioned that Nicholas Gray will take up a role at News Corp, moving from his role as managing director of the Australian, New South Wales and Prestige titles to lead the development and management of relationships with tech companies. I mean, that's a pretty big move from this company, which has been so critical about big tech. At the same time, they want someone who is just in charge of those relationships because it is just so crucial to what they do.
Well, it's interesting. I wonder how many other media organizations have someone, in Australia at least, have someone whose dedicated job is to just wine and dine and schmooze with the media, with tech companies. That's a fairly powerful role to be given, but also weirdly, just it could either be a very powerful role in which you now influence the relationship between Facebook and News Corp, or it could very easily sound like the kind of role you give someone when you don't want to fire them, but you do want them out of the way a little bit. So it could go either way.
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to think that I imagine that's a very important role for them. I mean, we saw when they got temporarily suspended from YouTube, Sky News, that is, how big that was from them. They no doubt want to make sure they've got people on top of that to make sure that hopefully doesn't happen again.
So every week we look at, in the interest of balance, we look at good News Corp story and a bad News Corp story. The idea being one where News Corp, defies our expectations by doing something that we would qualify as good, and another where News Corp lives up to our expectations by doing exactly what we think it would do. You want to go first with your bad News Corp story?
Yeah, we had a recommendation from our Facebook group, Murdochracy, on Facebook from Nicholas Pardee, who said he pointed to a editorial by the Oz, I think it was on Wednesday. So this is now, day 4 or 5 after Gladys Berejiklian resigned as a result of the ICAC investigation. She resigned in response to it. And as we covered last week, there were some very, very, angry people about someone choosing to resign over, not wanting to have allegations of corruption hanging over them.
Right.
There's an editorial on Wednesday said that no entity should be above the law, including ICAC. And so in the editorial, they say, well, actually, ICAC has kind of gone too far. And it said, the pledge by Amanda Stoker, the Federal Assistant Minister to the Attorney General, to stop a National Integrity Commission turning into a monster like New South Wales ICAC does not go far enough. I don't know. I the fact that they are now, still writing about this 5 days afterwards about someone who, may yet still be proven to be corrupt. We don't know. The investigation is still ongoing. Surely journalists should be on the side of ICAC, an institution that is investigating much like journalists do and trying to find corruption, that, a place that is actually trying to do something often with the reporting of journalists. I see what Nicholas is saying. I do think this was a bad example of News Corp this week.
I'm always flabbergasted by how blatant the relationship in Australia is between journalists and the politicians that they report on. From what's his name, Peter Van Onselen, talking about how Christian Porter's a friend, and then that bringing into question, then why have you been reporting on him in the first place? To what I've seen in the ABC offices myself, while working there, how many journalists are very chummy, senior journalists are very chummy with senior politicians from all sides of the aisle. And this is definitely not a thing where it's like, only Labour Party politicians. They're very friendly with Josh Frydenberg, with Tony Abbott, with all these people. And it's been quite remarkable. And then in the last few weeks to see just the shock and awe and basic hand waving that's been going on in most media outlets over how ICAC has done Gladys wrong. I just, it blows my mind.
Yeah, I agree. I'm with you, Nicholas. Bad take by the Oz. Sammy, you give us a proof of what they're doing well.
Okay, so this is, I don't even know if it's proof what they're doing well. It's something that, and I think you and I might disagree on how this went off, but Sherry Markson, when talking about her new book, which is, What They Did in Wuhan or something like that, the title is, and she basically had an interview with Ron Dean, where she was telling him about how she presented her book to US President, ex-president, still, called President Donald Trump. And it was a Zoom interview or a Skype interview or something. Well, no one uses Skype. It's probably a Zoom interview. And she held up a copy of her book on her end and then told the people in his room to give him a copy of her book. And you have never seen Donald Trump look more uncomfortable than when presented with a copy of someone's book.
I would love for Lynn to show you my book, if that's okay, the book that I've got coming out. I'll show it to you. I think she's got a copy there.
Sorry, it's just the cover of it, sir.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Well, I can see. Oh, good.
Yeah.
I look forward to reading it.
Thank you so much,
I
Mr.
look forward.
President.
Thank you
Really
very
enjoy
much.
your time.
Thank you very much. Good job.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
We have found that man's kryptonite. It was right in front of us after all. It is the written word. It is astonishing. He looked like you handed him a rotten penis. Like he literally was that disturbed by it. And then he looks at it first with disdain. Then he registers that maybe I should be actually making more of an effort to seem interested in this. And he goes, I look forward to reading it. Yeah, the guy the last book he read was apparently Mein Kampf is going to read Sherry. Well, that's the book.
I don't know about that.
That's the book that used to lie on his bedside table, according to two biographers. And he always went on about how great the book is, how Adolf Hitler's, was a great strategist, and how we should all be reading Mein Kampf because of what it teaches us about history.
Ooh.
This is a thing he has repeatedly said. I'm not making this up just to call him a white supremacist. I don't think Donald Trump's a white supremacist. I think Donald Trump is a Donald Trump supremacist, and then it just so happens that he happens to be white. But the reaction that, and Sherry Markson putting that clip on social media, a lot of people were asking. I saw in the Guardian, Amanda Mead said, why would she show this? I think she showed it to prove that she has a sense of humor. That was an awkward interaction, and most people would edit it out and cut it out. But I will say, as a person who's fairly critical of Sherry Markson's output most of the time, this was evidence of Sherry Markson being self-deprecating, I think.
Yeah, maybe it's a sign of a sense of humor. She did actually go afterwards to say in the interview, because this was part of her book launch, she did say that maybe Donald Trump wouldn't actually be too keen on her book because she is critical about him. So yeah, good on her.
He'll never find out. Let's be honest.
Totally. And don't be afraid to show everything that happens, warts and all. That's true transparency.
Exactly. It's the closest we've gotten to date.
Jennine Khalik is a Palestinian Australian who's worked across the Australian journalism industry, from public broadcaster to independent journalism to working at News Corp. During her career, she's spoken about the opposition she's faced just for being Palestinian and writing about Palestine and Israel, some of which has been captured in the new book by veteran journalist John Lyons, Dateline Jerusalem, Journalism's Toughest Assignment. Hi, and welcome to Medocracy, Jennine.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's
good to have you here. Jennine, why did you go into journalism in the first place?
It's such a good question. I actually wanted to practice law and be a lawyer of some sort. And I got into law at uni, and I mean, the options that were available to me at UTS were to do a, double degree. So I thought journalism, I thought there'd be a, quite a nice parallel in the sense that I also saw it's, I guess, the opportunity to tell stories and to write about things that, that are important to a lot of people and don't necessarily get, much coverage in our very sort of white, homogenous media landscape.
What I find interesting is how many people I know who started off as lawyers and then became something else. Like lawyers who became comedians, lawyers who became writers, lawyers who became journalists. I'm surprised anyone ever. They are lawyers. I'm shocked at the fact that anyone ever finishes a law degree. So you're not the first one to walk away from that industry.
That makes me feel better. I honestly, I was just so burnt out, and oh my god, law school was just so many private school wankers. Like, no offense to anyone here or beyond, actually offense if you went to private school, but felt so out of place. But it was the same in journalism.
You worked at News Corp for the early part of your career and for like quite a few years. Was it 5 or 6 years in the end?
Yeah.
Which publications did you work for?
So I started off at the local papers, and the local papers here are predominantly owned by News Corp. So I was at the Parramatta Advertiser and the Fairfield Advance. And I was at uni helping out, just being a bit of a nerd. There was a conference run by the Australian Centre of Independent Journalism when it existed. And so I was helping out doing social media for the conference. And one of the people on the panel, it was Clive Matheson, who was, the editor at The Australian at the time. And he just seemed, I mean, I had some kind of idea that The Australian, had a bad reputation, I suppose, on many sort of different issues. But for me, I look at Fairfax at the time, and I mean, it wasn't very inspiring either. I think I was just very cynical about a lot of the mainstream outlets. And he just seemed like a really kind of normal, reasonable guy. And I went up to the panelists after just to chat with them and sort of, let them know that I was doing the social, and if there was anything else, they wanted to add. And I had a conversation with him, and yeah, I mean, he gave me his card and he was like, contact me. I'd like to, you already work at our local papers, and it'd be great if you got in touch and we can see if there are, any opportunities for you at The Australian. So I didn't give him much thought, and I didn't email him, I think, until perhaps a year later. But yeah, I mean, I was quite, I suppose, it was a mixture of being cynical and naive. I thought that I could go in to sort of any space and, exact some kind of change, not institutionally or anything, but be a voice of difference and, diversify shit, I suppose.
At what point while working for News Corp did you become aware of the fact that your Palestinian identity is something that is a point of concern, a point of difference, a point of noteworthiness in a positive or negative way for staff internally and people externally?
So it was when I started at The Australian. It wasn't at the local papers because we were reporting, about cats stuck in trees and that sort of thing. It was very, like local news stories and
The joys of local journalism.
I mean, there was a lot of, fluff and, some council meetings. It didn't obviously explore anything sort of on the national or international level. But at the Oz, I mean, I noticed it. It was in the first week. One particular journalist who had introduced themselves to me, and I won't go into detail of it. It was very sus and it was a very weird introduction. And they realized that I, speak and read Arabic. And so they wanted help with translating, something that they're doing with a story. And me being in my first week, I mean, I was just like, okay, don't really want to upset anyone. So I translated a couple of quotes from Arabic to English, and I didn't know the context of the story, but it was just about freedom of speech or something like that. Anyway, I found out later it was about Raif Badawi, who has been imprisoned by Saudi Arabia because of his writings. He's being declared a heretic, and these were quotes from his wife. And so it's a really sad story. But what I didn't know until later was that it was a story given to this person by there's an organization called UN Watch, and it's run by this guy who watches the UN, but ultimately he thinks that the UN focuses a bit too much on the state of Israel and its crimes against humanity, and so tries to monitor other horrible states like Saudi Arabia. So I mean, it's a very sort of disingenuous agenda. It's not consistent whatsoever. But so this person was sitting at their computer with their emails open, and I had finished translating, and I went over to their desk to let them know, and I was just sort of like waiting behind them, and I think I recall that they were on the phone, but the email that they had in front of them, there was an email thread between them, and the email thread there was my name. They were talking about me. And yeah, I just kind of was like, what the fuck is going on? Like Vic Al-Hadef, who justified the massacring in Gaza in 2014. Vic Al-Hadef, the same man, when I think it was a few years before that, turned around and called me a terrorist when I was sitting behind him at a Macquarie University panel. It was, a discussion on Palestine, and he was there sitting in front of me recording. I had no idea who he was, but he had asked a really stupid question, and me sitting behind him, I scoffed, and he turned around. I was like, oh, terrorist. I guess that was my first brush with a bit of weirdness. And then I, over the coming weeks and months, I was called into meetings with the HR manager, with the editors, just telling me to stop tweeting. So, I mean, around the time, there's always something happening in Palestine, but sort of retweeting and tweeting what was happening on the ground in Palestine, or just the realities that Palestinian refugees like my family face. And then I was called into another meeting with the HR manager who was just very blunt. Like they didn't give me a reason for it. They were just like, you need to, not tweet any of these things. Meanwhile, another journalist, at the paper, many others, openly would talk about going to IDF fundraisers, like Zionist fundraisers, some sort of like Friends of IDF event. And almost in a way I felt, next to me, they talk about it as if to almost provoke me or just create this really uncomfortable, hostile environment. But I just ignored it. And I guess my my form of protest was changing my monitor's background to I think it was like some Palestinian artwork, and then all these like white people who work there would walk past me like, oh, that's really pretty, like what is that? And I'd be like, oh, that's from Palestine, that's Palestinian, which would, I think, really get under the skin of the same people who'd be talking about supporting the IDF and that kind of thing. So that was my like little tiny active resistance. But other than that, I mean, I kept my head down and I didn't engage with it. But I was called into a meeting with the HR manager who just set it straight. And she was like, you need to stop, you know, the pro-Israel lobbyists. And she used the term, you know, Jewish lobbyists. This was at the Oz. And that had actually come up, you know, a few times as well, not just at the Oz, but, you know, at the ABC. And I was kind of like, you know, shaken up. And yeah, and then I was followed by two members of the Israeli Foreign Ministry and at a barbecue with Clive Matheson, and this is in John's book. I mentioned it to him. I was like, this is really weird. I was just followed by these two members of the Israeli Foreign Ministry.
By followed, you mean on social media or
they
physically followed?
Oh, no, on social media. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And Clive said to me, and again, this is in the book, he was like, yeah, they were literally here not long ago and they had a meeting with us. And I was like, what? What's going on? And they had a meeting with Clive and the others about me. And I don't think I would have ever found this out if I didn't sort of bring it up, right? Like I think he just didn't want me to worry. And he was like, yeah, I mean, they're just like really concerned that we've hired a Palestinian. And, you know, they don't want you to be working there. They're really concerned about you. And, you know, at this point, I mean, I'm a 21-year-old, you know, shit posting on the internet, just like trying to report and do stories and sort of make some career in journalism, that I was of concern to them. And so, yeah, over the following like 2 years, it was that constantly. And it was emails, it was phone calls, it was being, you know, having a national chief of staff come up to me and being like, we just got this phone call, we just got this email, you need to, you know, and this was in reference to, you know, some of the stories that I did as well. I mean, I pitched stories that, you know, one story, for example, was about how the some of the Zionist lobby groups were trying to have a play written by a Palestinian playwright based in Melbourne. Her name is Samah Sabawi, removed from the education curriculum. So it was on the drama curriculum. And it's a love story set in Gaza. And they just went, you know, haywire and said it's anti-Semitic. You know, you can't have this, you know, being taught to students. When it really, really, really was like Romeo and Juliet, but set in Gaza. And so I did a story on that, and, you know, I had spoken to some insiders at the Department of Education in Victoria who confirmed to me this is what was happening, the pressure that they were feeling. And so I had that story run. And I mean, like, for all of the Australians' faults, I would say that when I pitched those stories, there would be some hesitancy, but I also stood my ground. I think, you know, journalists can't just take no for an answer initially. You need to make your case and say X, Y, and Z. And so they ran that story. And once again, as with many other stories, I found myself the target of these lobbyists who are just really pissed off that I was there, firstly, just existing as a Palestinian, and not, you know, I was completely unapologetic about it, but also because I was writing these stories that reflected poorly on them.
There was one particular story that I found hugely shocking in John's book about your interaction with a sub-editor. Can you share that?
Yeah, so this was in March 2017. And so to placate the lobbyists, and because I had, I'd committed the awful crime of retweeting a few things about Palestine and Gaza, I was essentially shafted to the arts section. So I was no longer sort of covering or allowed to cover broader news stories. So to them, the arts section is, it's just like benign, and I would sort of be hidden there. And the editor at the time of the arts section actually forwarded me an email saying this could be a nice story. And it was the story about a Palestinian refugee in Palestine. There are stateless Palestinians in Palestine as well, who lived in a refugee camp. And he was a singer, and he was actually going to be touring, parts of Australia with a Sydney orchestra, something like that. And that was, it was really it was a nice story. And so it being, the arts section, and the arts section is also about spruiking, events that are coming up and that sort of thing. This was, happening in about a week or two. And so I spoke to the singer, and I interviewed him, and, I wrote the piece, and I, sent it off to be, to be sub-edited and then printed. And I was sitting at my desk when, this was like in the afternoon, when the sub-editor comes like storming over, and he slams the copy of the story, like the paper copy, on the filing cabinet, like next to my desk, like just slams it really hard. And I was startled. And he just went on this massive, diatribe. He started shouting, saying, like, Palestine does not exist. You wrote Palestine in this story. Do I have to teach you how to be a fucking journalist? You're not a journalist. I'm going to have to teach you. And just went on and on. And he was just like red in the face. His eyes were just like popping out. And it was freaking terrifying. And I was like in shock. And I tried to, calmly respond. And, I was like, look, whether you agree with it or not, and I don't agree with it, there is a quote unquote state of Palestine that is a non-member of the UN, in the same way that the Vatican is. I mean, personally, I don't believe there should be like two states. I think there should be one state where all Palestinians and Israelis are equal, from the river to the sea. Because we have the right to return, and that's the case under international law. And so I was trying to explain it to him that, even if you disagree with that, and I disagree with this politically, like I'm coming from a totally different way, but we can say, like journalistically, we are able to say Palestine because we are referring to the quote unquote state of Palestine. And he wouldn't take it. He was like, this is nonsense. Just completely kind of ripped me apart. And no one said like anything. I think that's what sticks out to me as well. And that no one around who saw and heard him screaming and yelling at me, and telling me that I was, not a journalist, that I didn't know how to be a journalist. Like no one stood up for me or even checked up on me. And then he took the copy away, and he stormed off. And I remember, just like I was in shock, and I picked up my phone and I just went to the bathroom and like called my mom, and I was in tears. I was like, what the fuck just happened right now? So yeah, it was very humiliating, but also I guess, very, in a way, unsurprising. Very telling of, the sentiment that was held by a lot of people that work there. And, I had found out that some of my colleagues also, were talking about me. And one of them was putting like a dossier together with anything that like I've tweeted or said. And had taken it to the editors at the time to try and get me fired. And the colleagues as well were saying like, I can't believe like she works here. She's just a Palestinian activist.
So before we kind of get into how much of this is also present in the wider news media, not just singling out News Corp or not just singling out the Australian, for example, there is something that I wonder about always, which is the central thesis, for example, of Dateline Jerusalem Journalism Stuff as Assignment, which is John Lyon's book, as well as some the many of the stories that you and a few others have told. Is that Israel has an undue level of influence on newsrooms in Australia, and some have argued in newsrooms in many Western countries. Um, at the same time, I'm very aware of that trope, that anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish trope that goes back so long ago, that Jews control the media, and it is a very damaging thing. And it's a very dangerous trope to kind of buy into. How do how do we balance those two? Those two possibilities, that on one side there's this white supremacist anti-Semitic kind of trope about Jews controlling media, and the other is the claims and accusations and fairly detailed evidence provided stories in John Lyon's books about Israel having influence on media in Australia.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really loaded question, because there is sort of nothing to balance, because this isn't, it's not about this horrible anti-Semitic trope about Jews controlling the media. This is about people, whoever they might be, whatever their backgrounds are. And a lot of these editors, and people that work at media outlets aren't Jewish. It's about them not wanting to upset some of these lobbyists. Like I it's unfortunate, and I think it's because a lot of Zionists and people who are pro-Israel have long conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, when it's just simply not the case. And people don't want to be called anti-Semitic. You don't want to be called anti-Semitic. And it's not even a question about being called such. It's that the practice of criticizing a state, criticizing any state, is not it's not, if I criticize Saudi Arabia, which I do often, it doesn't make me an Islamophobe. It doesn't make me a self-hating Muslim. So yeah, I just think it's a really dangerous conflation that's actually been pushed quite a lot by Zionists themselves, and they go after anti-Zionist Jews, and they question their their sort of loyalty to Jewish people. I mean, that in and of itself is anti-Semitic. To tell a Jewish person that because they don't support the state of Israel, and because they critique the state of Israel, that must make them a self-hating Jew. And yeah, it's just this crazy sort of equivalence between a state and like a faith / ethnicity. So I mean, of course, those sorts of accusations are leveled. These sorts of conflations and accusations are used to as a chill effect, to quieten, to silence Palestinians and allies, and to sort of boost the narrative that the state of Israel is a beacon of democracy.
Now, Janine, I want to ask as well, we focus on News Corp here, but of course, like, this is by no means unique to News Corp having pressure from pro-Israel lobby. You've worked at the ABC, you've worked for Crikey, Have you seen similar things happen at different companies as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This occurred at the ABC. This isn't in the book, but the Israeli ambassador also went to Gavin Morris, who has now resigned. So maybe I can say this. About me and my reporting on the young Palestinian woman who was brutally killed, Aya Masawi, in Melbourne. And so she's a Palestinian citizen of the state of Israel. And they were just really uncomfortable with the fact that I called her a Palestinian citizen of Israel and not the official state of Israel's term, the Israeli Arabs, which is just extremely erasing. So, that was also kind of really scary. And, soon after, I believe I was, pretty much managed out of that job. But yeah, I pitched stories as well at the ABC. And I, was told there was one incident where I had pitched a story and it was, and I've mentioned this before, like it was newsworthy. It was definitely, timely and relevant, like locally as well. It wasn't, just this is an international story that has nothing to do with, say, like the New South Wales newsroom. And the chief of staff at the time said to me, look, this is a story, but, I just don't want to get into it, and start something with the Jewish lobby. And that's what she said. She said, the Jewish lobby. Again, like I personally would say, the Zionist lobby or pro-Israel lobby groups. But there was this endemic fear of upsetting and sort of releasing the wrath of these lobbyists who would, send in a bloody ambassador to go and speak to, editors and bosses. And, I have friends and former colleagues at the ABC and SBS who have been targeted in much the same way, who aren't Palestinian. But, if they're reporting, mentions, occupation for whatever reason, and it somehow made it through, there will be, there'll be, like heads chopped off, really. It's such a hostile work environment. And I recall at the Sydney Morning Herald, and a full investigation was launched into a crossword puzzle because one of the answers to the crossword puzzle was Palestine. And they lobbied so hard that there was an investigation into how this happened. And I'm pretty sure there was an apology as well.
Janine, hearing about that is, I'm kind of gobsmacked hearing about it, and I'm sure we could keep talking about it forever. You've been in the industry now for 10 years. I know you're not currently working in it. Have you seen any shift happening? Do you think that there is a chance that things will improve?
Look, I really hope so. I mean, I'm generally cynical about these things, but we have seen, a shift, and not just in sort of the media landscape, but I think in terms of global and sort of grassroots on the ground, opinion from so many people. But I mean, earlier this year, me and a few others spearheaded an open letter to the media to do better on Palestine, and that got over 700 signatures of many people who work in Australian newsrooms, and some prominent journalists and writers signing it, because they see it for themselves. They see, like, by omission, that there are issues, and that we need to be doing better on Palestine.
Janine, if people want to follow your work, what's the best way?
Well, I'm terminally online at Twitter, so they can follow me on Twitter at Jennine AK, so JennineAK. I guess that's where most of my stuff is at. I also do have a podcast. I've only done 2 episodes in like a year and a half, so it's not going terribly well, but I'm, giving it some life again, which is called Undivine Intervention. But all of that stuff will be available on Twitter, which is where you can find me.
Great name, Undivine Intervention. Janine, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Cam. I really appreciate it. And thanks, Sammy.
That was Jennine Khalik, a Palestinian Australian who's worked across the Australian journalism industry from public broadcasters to independent journalism at News Corp.
Thank you all for listening to episode 5. Now, if you haven't already subscribed and you've somehow stumbled across this MP3 somewhere, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, just about anywhere. And as we plugged before, we do have a podcast group on Facebook at Murderocracy. Thanks so much, Sammy.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me as always, Cam.
And thanks as well to Kevin McLeod for the theme music, Ruby Innes for our artwork. We will catch you next week. Bye.
Bye.